In the shadow of the March 22nd Moscow theater attack, an interesting intelligence game is publicly playing out. On one side, you have the Kremlin, and on the other, you have Washington. And how that game ends will have a huge impact on what happens next in Ukraine. It all started on March 7th, just a short trip from the Kremlin, over at the US Embassy. The mission issued a warning that the United States was, quote, monitoring reports that extremists have imminent plans to target large gatherings in Moscow, to include concerts. With that, they advised Americans still in the country to avoid crowded areas for the next 2 days. In addition, the United States privately informed Russian officials about the intelligence that led to the public warning. However, it would be another 13 days before the reality of the situation set in. Though ISIS-K immediately claimed the attack, Russian President Vladimir Putin's condolence speech attempted to tie it to Ukraine. Thus, the plot thickens. At the moment, we are in a bit of a holding pattern, waiting to see just how far the Kremlin continues down this path, or if public links between the two will cease. This matters because, to the extent that the connection is believed by the Russian public, the Kremlin will have an easier time building support to pursue the war with greater intensity than was possible before. But there is another player here. The game arises because the United States may have intelligence that it could release, which might take the Kremlin's preferred narrative and shatter it. Simultaneously, though, the United States might be reluctant to declassify such information, because it risks harming its intelligence-gathering methods. How would crafty leaders from both sides handle these interlocking incentives? To get a better understanding of the strategic problem, here is what is on tap for today's video. We will start with the duty to warn policy that first led to the US warning. What is publicly known about how the warnings played out? A deeper discussion of Russia's incentive to establish a link to Ukraine. Domestic issues that come along with drawing that connection. How Russia would want to behave if the Kremlin knew the quality of the United States' evidence and the risks that declassification creates. And finally, the more plausible but more complicated case, where Russia is not quite sure what the United States wants to do here. But we begin with the duty to warn. It will not surprise you to find out that the United States spends more money on intelligence than any other country. More than a decade ago, the last time we had a good audit of this, the annual price tag was $52.6 billion, and one imagines that it has only increased massively since then. Correspondingly, U.S. intelligence agencies learn a great deal about what is on the verge of happening, both to the United States and to the rest of the world. In 2015, back during the Obama administration, Director of National Intelligence James Clapper issued a new directive known as the Duty to Warn. We go to the papers, which we know are authentic because of how poor the official scan is. Basically, if the United States has compelling information regarding an impending threat of an intentional killing, serious bodily injury, or kidnapping, then the intelligence community has a duty to warn the potential target. This principle applies to both U.S. targets and worldwide, including to citizens of America's traditional geopolitical opponents. In fact, we already saw such a warning earlier this year. On January 3rd, Iran held a large gathering to commemorate the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, an Iranian general that the Trump administration ordered a strike against in 2020. ISIS-K, yep, here's that group again, planned to bomb the gathering. Now, I know that this is difficult, but if we try to look past the triangle of antipathy for a moment, the United States had credible intelligence that this was about to happen, and alerted the Iranian government, consistent with the duty to warn. You really do have to appreciate the degree of irony here. The United States assassinated an Iranian general, Iranian citizens were commemorating his death, and the United States tried to stop further Iranian deaths. But civilians are not generals, and hence the warning came out. even if the Iranian government did not heed that warning, resulting in 95 deaths. In any case, the purpose of the duty to warn doctrine was to improve the United States' moral standing internationally. Civilians from the United States are on par with civilians from Russia, Iran, or elsewhere, and the US intelligence community will not play politics on that front. Or at least that's the public policy. Now, and this will be important for later, the duty to warn is not absolute. Back to the papers. You do not have to warn someone who is involved in various militant or illegal activities. You do not have to warn someone who already knows about the issue. Gotta say, I love it when lawyers add such obvious caveats. It is like when those prescription drug commercials say things like, "Do not take this drug if you are allergic to it." Anyway, you do not need to warn the victim if you cannot warn the victim. But, most importantly for our purposes, you do not need to issue a warning if by doing so you compromise the source of the intelligence. Fittingly, it appears that there are 5 classified characters in that caveat that apparently will compromise US national security. In any case, that takes us to the specific warnings that the United States gave to Russia on the eve of the attack. As mentioned at the top, the US Embassy warning came on March 7th. Some unspecified time soon thereafter, US officials also privately spoke to Russian officials about it. Then, on March 19th, during this speech to the Federal Security Service Board, Putin said, in reference to the US warnings, that all these actions resemble outright blackmail and the intention to intimidate and destabilize our society. Now, this is not an unreasonable concern. We talk at length on this channel about how talk is cheap in international coercion. To place the warning in better context, Western countries have put the economic squeeze on Russia ever since February 2022. It turns out that getting everyone in Moscow to sit at home for weeks on end would be a great way to further sabotage the Russian economy. And we, as outside observers, do not have a good idea of whether those private warnings contained any verifiable information that Russia could trust, or if it was the diplomatic equivalent of the internet meme, "Source, trust me, bro." Obviously, in retrospect, we know that the warning was legitimate, even if the predicted timing was a bit early. And with that, perhaps Putin's earlier comments might have been better worded along the lines of, "US intelligence is not trustworthy. We are therefore cautious of any warnings coming from Washington. However, we of course take all legitimate threats seriously." And, to be fair, although this previous quote is what circulated in Western media, which does indeed look bad for the Kremlin, if we go just 2 sentences later, Putin's speech at the Federal Security Board meeting details the further countermeasures that Russia should implement to guard against potential attacks. But this still leaves the Kremlin in a bit of a quandary. Regardless of the true origin of the attack, the Kremlin has a strong incentive to link it to Ukraine. In fact, that is what all of the internet chatter focused on for the first couple of hours after the assault. However, ISIS-K did not let that conversation last long. The group, through the broader media arm of ISIS, claimed responsibility for the attack. Shortly thereafter, they released a video, shot by the perpetrators, which left little doubt that it was indeed an ISIS affiliate that committed the attack. Now, if it seems strange that a group would want to draw heat on itself like that, it is not. Remember, a major reason that militant groups commit attacks is to draw recruitment and donations to their organizations. So videos like this one may be bizarre to us, but they serve as a powerful recruitment tool for those that are into that kind of thing. But even if direct responsibility falls on ISIS-K, Russia can still be circumspect about whether there was material support coming from Ukraine. The upshot for the Kremlin here is to draw greater public support for the war. In the immediate aftermath of the Russian presidential election, Russia had announced a goal to expand its army. Where those soldiers will come from is unclear, and the last time Russia did a general mobilization, here back in September 2022, it did not go over well with the general population. But there is a clear potential solution. If you want round 2 of mobilization, you might want to take advantage of the rally round the flag effect from March 22nd. But that requires the Russian population believing the attack connects to Ukraine. There are 2 main barriers to that. Let's start with the quicker one: whether Russians will buy into it. This is a basic question of how much control over the media narrative that the Kremlin has. The main strategic and political issue here is that ISIS-K likely poses a long-term problem for Russia. Rewinding. Part of Putin's ascension to power was predicated on his ability to take strong, decisive action against threats to the homeland. But let's fast forward to today. If the message is just Ukraine, 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 and all of the resources are funneling there, and nothing is going to combat ISIS-K, then skeptical Russians will worry that ISIS-K will only grow stronger, and the Kremlin is not addressing another serious problem. Now, clearly the Kremlin's ability to speak to the masses has been effective over the last 2 decades. But this is a new problem, and with that comes new questions. Then again, it is not like a free press is guaranteed to prevent one attack from selling an unrelated war. The more interesting barrier is the intelligence game taking place between Moscow and Washington. Think about the range of possible claims that the Kremlin could make, going from declaring no responsibility from Ukraine to complete responsibility. Something like Kyiv hiring, supplying, and planning the mission, but just passing the final execution of it over to ISIS-K. The more that the Kremlin claims, and, just as important, the more that Russian citizens believe it, the more support that the Kremlin obtains for the war effort in Ukraine. Presumably, though, given the earlier warnings, the United States has some level of intelligence that it can release that will influence those beliefs. Let this arrow represent how the pivotal Russian citizen would feel about the Ukrainian connection if the United States were to put all of its cards on the table. Note that this arrow here is not describing what the actual truth is with a capital T, just whatever the result of the public discourse will be. If you think that the United States can present compelling evidence and Russians will believe it, then the arrow should be down here. If you think that the United States has very little it can reveal, or that Russian citizens will collectively ignore anything coming from Washington, then the arrow can go wherever the Kremlin wants to take it. Personally, I am just going to leave the arrow in the middle for the sake of illustrating the main strategic point. Obviously, the United States prefers beliefs to go as far to the left as possible. Consequently, you might imagine that if Russia begins claiming a connection this extreme, then Washington might reveal the evidence that it has, so it can reset the pivotal citizen's belief. However, there is another consideration at play. Remember how the duty to warn policy has a caveat about protecting intel gathering? Well, that protection issue is a more general concern. And as Washington starts declassifying everything that it knows, the more potential damage it begins to incur. This creates a trade-off between influencing the current debate and compromising sources. Imagine that this line represents that trade-off, standardized according to the value of the influence campaign. If revelation will compromise a ton of valuable sources, it will be very big. But if the United States cares little about the sources and a ton about the consequences of the war, it will be small. When you affix the exposure costs to the outcome that the United States can force, you get something interesting. This becomes Washington's maximum acceptable distortion. That is, Washington will tolerate Russian claims up to here. Yes, revelation could shift that belief back here, but doing so is not worth risking the sources. Thus, the intelligence game is for Russia to create distortions, subject to that constraint. It does not make sense to distort out to here, because that ultimately triggers Washington's revelation, which ends up reverting the final belief back to here. But given these constraints, it also does not make sense for Russia to set a claim to here, because the United States is less persuasive than that. Nor does it make sense for Russia to set a claim to here. Even though the United States can break that belief, Washington would not want to, so as to protect its sources. Instead, the best distortion is right here, just enough to convince the United States not to publicize due to the cost. Note that as the United States has more persuasive evidence, the maximum acceptable distortion shifts down with it, and thus the further to the left that Russia must live with. However, the costlier it is to reveal, the further that Russia can push it. Erasing everything for a moment, it seems that Russia was initially signaling a connection about here, with Putin giving a vague description of the attackers trying to escape to Ukraine. But in the days that have followed, the messaging has steadily drifted rightward. This would suggest that either Russia believes that a release cannot do much, or that the US cost of revelation is high. I should emphasize the word believe there, because both of those pieces of information are hard to precisely know. As such, it is worth discussing how this scenario plays out, when Russia is not certain just where the critical line is. Before, the reason that Russia presented this narrative was because it knew where the United States could push the belief to, and it knew the cost that the United States paid to do so. But this is the world of intelligence that we are talking about, and so knowing those things can be a little bit opaque. This gives rise to something known as a risk-return trade-off. Suppose that Russia does not know where the critical point is, but rather believes it could be in a variety of different locations. Then the deeper the connection that Russia tries to draw, the better the outcome for Russia, conditional on the United States not revealing in response. Going back to the name, this is the return part of the risk-return trade-off. The risk part is that the United States becomes more likely to release information as Russia pushes to the right. Here, these three possible United Stateses would reveal. If we focus on what number 3 can do, we see just how much this backfires for Russia. The final perception reverts all the way back to here, whereas Russia could have obtained to here if it knew the true US capacity. What this means is that Russia might try to roll the dice on some aggressive stance, which ultimately could lead to a good outcome for Russia, but also could lead to a deeper intelligence battle. Let the gambling begin. You know, for the price of less than a single minimum bet at the roulette wheel, you can pick up a copy of one of my books on the Russia-Ukraine war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.